The brass button lay half buried in the shale, its fouled anchor motif worn smooth by the ice. I picked it up. The metal was heavy, cold enough to burn the skin through my glove. It was August on King William Island, but the wind off the Victoria Strait still carried the bite of deep winter. 129 men sailed into this archipelago in the summer of 1845 under the command of Captain Sir John Franklin. They carried 3 years of provisions, steam engines, and the full confidence of the British Admiralty. They were tasked with charting the final unmapped section of the Northwest Passage. None of them returned. I stood on the western shoreline, looking out at the pack ice, holding the only piece of a uniform I would find that day. In the spring of 1845, the British Admiralty prepared to close the final gap in the map of the Canadian Arctic. I reviewed the Admiralty manifests from that year. The scale of the preparation was absolute. Second Secretary Sir John Barrow championed the expedition. The objective was the Northwest Passage, a navigable sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Only a stretch of roughly 300 miles remained uncharted between Barrow Strait and the northern coast of the mainland. To chart it, the Admiralty selected 2 bomb vessels, Her Majesty's ship Erebus, 372 tons, and Her Majesty's ship Terror, 325 tons. Both ships had proven their durability in the Antarctic under James Clark Ross. They were built with heavy cross-bracing to withstand the crushing pressure of pack ice. For this expedition, the naval yards at Woolwich fitted them with steam power. They installed 20-horsepower locomotive engines, adapted from the London and Greenwich Railway, into the holds. These engines drove single-screw propellers that could be retracted into iron wells when the ice closed in. The bows were sheathed in heavy iron plating. Below decks, a network of copper tubing circulated hot water to maintain a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the crew quarters, even when the outside air dropped to -40. The command was given to Captain Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old. He had led 2 previous overland expeditions in the Arctic and served as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land. Captain Francis Crozier, a veteran of 6 Arctic and Antarctic voyages, commanded Terror. Commander James Fitzjames served as Franklin's second-in-command on Erebus. The Admiralty received hundreds of applications from officers and sailors eager to join. They selected 134 men. The crew included ice masters, carpenters, sailmakers, and Royal Marines. They were issued heavy wool slops, canvas jackets, and leather sea boots. The Admiralty provided the finest navigational instruments of the era: chronometers, sextants, dipping needles, and artificial horizons. The officers brought personal libraries, mahogany writing desks, and silver cutlery. The ships carried libraries totaling 2,900 books, ranging from technical manuals to the novels of Charles Dickens. I have seen the daguerreotypes taken by Richard Beard before their departure. Commander Fitzjames looks directly into the lens, his uniform crisp, his expression resolute. Captain Franklin's portrait shows a heavy-set man, his gaze slightly off-camera, wearing the Star of the Guelphic Order. The expedition was not merely a voyage of discovery, it was a demonstration of industrial capability. The Admiralty believed that steam power and modern provisioning had rendered the Arctic environment manageable. They planned for a voyage of 2 to 3 years. The orders were clear: sail through Lancaster Sound, proceed west and south, and emerge into the Bering Strait. Franklin received his final instructions on May 5, 1845. When I examined the victualling logs in the naval archives, the sheer tonnage of the cargo was difficult to comprehend. The Admiralty Victualling Yard supplied the expedition with rations intended to last 3 full years, with the possibility of extending to 4 if strictly rationed. The manifests record the exact quantities loaded into the holds. They carried 61,980 pounds of salted beef and pork, packed in heavy oak barrels. They loaded 35,000 pounds of flour and 9,000 pounds of concentrated soup. To prevent scurvy, the medical stores included 9,300 pounds of lemon juice, stored in glass carboys, along with thousands of pounds of pickled cabbage and dried vegetables. They loaded 136 tons of coal onto Erebus and 118 tons onto Terror. The most significant addition to the stores was tinned meat. The Admiralty contracted a merchant named Stephen Goldner to supply 8,000 tins of preserved beef, mutton, and veal. Goldner received the contract late, and his workers sealed the tins in haste, using lead solder. The tins were heavy, some weighing up to 8 pounds, and were stacked deep in the lower holds alongside the coal and the iron water tanks. The expedition also carried 2,000 pounds of tobacco, 3,600 gallons of high-proof rum, and hundreds of pounds of chocolate and tea. The holds were packed so tightly that the crew had barely enough room to sling their hammocks. On the morning of May 19, 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror slipped their moorings at Greenheath. The crews manned the rigging and cheered as they were towed down the River Thames by the steam tug Blazer. They sailed north along the eastern coast of Britain, stopping briefly at Stromness in the Orkney Islands to take on fresh water and a final delivery of live oxen. The ships then turned west, crossing the North Atlantic toward the coast of Greenland. The crossing was rough. Heavy gales battered the heavily laden vessels, washing several of the deck-stowed provisions overboard. Despite the weather, the crew maintained their routine. The officers took daily meteorological readings, recording barometric pressure, air temperature, and the temperature of the surface water. The logbooks from this early leg of the voyage show a disciplined, orderly progression. The men were divided into watches, the steam engines were tested, and the carpenters made minor repairs to the rigging. By late June, they sighted the jagged, ice-covered peaks of Cape Farewell, the southern tip of Greenland. They sailed north up the western coast, navigating through fields of loose-pack ice and towering icebergs. The water was dark and heavy, the sky a pale, continuous grey. On July 4, they anchored at the Whalefish Islands in Disco Bay. Here, they met the transport ship Barretto Jr., which had followed them from England carrying additional supplies. For a week, the crews worked 12-hour shifts, transferring the final loads of coal, fresh meat, and tin provisions from the transport to the Erebus and Terror. The ships were now loaded beyond them. At the Whalefish Islands, the reality of the Arctic summer set in. The sun did not set. The men worked in continuous daylight, surrounded by the sounds of shifting ice and the constant crying of seabirds. While the crews transferred the final tons of cargo, the officers and men wrote their last letters home. I read the copies of these letters. They provide the final first-hand accounts of the expedition's state of mind. Captain Franklin wrote to his wife, Jane, detailing the good health of the crew and the excellent performance of the ships. Commander Fitzjames wrote a long, detailed letter to his sister-in-law, describing the stark beauty of the Greenland coast and the steady, quiet demeanor of Captain Crozier. Fitzjames noted that the men were in high spirits, eager to reach Lancaster Sound before the brief summer navigation season ended. The letters contain no premonitions of disaster. They are filled with requests for books, inquiries about family finances, and promises to write again from the Pacific coast of Russia. Before the transport ship departed, 5 men were discharged from the expedition and sent back to England. 2 men had fallen ill with respiratory infections, and 3 others were deemed unfit for the rigors of the voyage. This reduction left exactly 129 men across the 2 ships. The names of the discharged men were struck from the muster rolls. They were the only members of the expedition who would see their homes again. On July 12, 1845, the Barretto Jr. weighed anchor and turned south. The crew of the transport ship watched as Erebus and Terror fired a parting salute. The 2 bomb vessels then turned north, their black hulls standing out sharply against the white ice of Baffin Bay. They were heading for Melville Bay, a notoriously difficult stretch of water known to whalers as the Middle Ice. The strategy was to follow the Greenland coast northward until the ice thinned, then cut westward across Baffin Bay toward the entrance of Lancaster Sound. The navigation required constant vigilance. The ice masters, James Reed on Erebus and Thomas Blanqui on Terror, spent their days in the crow's nests, scanning the horizon for leads of open water. The steam engines were kept ready, their fires banked, to provide a sudden burst of power if the ice began to close around the hulls. The weather remained cold but clear. The officers continued their scientific observations, deploying the deep-sea clamshell dredge to collect specimens from the ocean floor and using the dipping needles to measure the Earth's magnetic field. They were entering a region where standard compasses became sluggish and unreliable, pulled off course by the proximity of the North Magnetic Pole. The men relied on the sun, the stars, and the specialized instruments provided by the Admiralty. They sailed further north. The final confirmed sightings of the Franklin expedition occurred in late July 1845 in the upper reaches of Baffin Bay. I traced their coordinates on the modern charts, noting how far they still had to go. 2 British whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, were operating near Melville Bay, hunting bowhead whales along the edge of the pack ice. On July 26, Captain Dannett of the Prince of Wales spotted 2 large, square-rigged vessels moored to an iceberg. He recognized them immediately as naval ships by their yellow upper bands and black hulls. Dannett altered course and brought his ship within hailing distance. He spoke with several officers, though he did not record their names in his log. The naval officers informed him that they were waiting for the ice in Lancaster Sound to break up so they could proceed westward. They invited Dannett to dine with Captain Franklin the following day. Dannett declined, citing a favorable shift in the wind that he wished to exploit for his whaling operations. 2 days later, on July 28, Captain Robert Martin of the Enterprise also encountered the expedition. Martin went aboard the Erebus and spoke directly with Captain Franklin and Icemaster James Reed. Franklin told Martin that he had provisions for 5 years if necessary, and that the crew was in perfect health. Reed told the whaling captain that they intended to push through the ice as soon as a lead opened. The iceberg they were moored to was described as massive, providing a temporary harbor from the drifting floes. The water temperature was recorded at 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The whaling captains noted the sheer scale of the naval vessels compared to their own merchant ships. The Erebus and Terror were fortresses of oak and iron, bristling with rigging and scientific apparatus. Martin noted that the ships were heavily laden, sitting deep in the water, but appeared well secured. The weather was calm, the sea flat and choked with heavy floes. Martin returned to his ship, and the Enterprise sailed south. These 2 encounters are the last reliable observations of the expedition by outside witnesses. The logbooks of the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise place the Erebus and Terror at roughly 74 degrees, 48 minutes north latitude, and 66 degrees, 13 minutes west longitude. After July 28, the historical record goes dark. The ships did not return to England in 1847, as the Admiralty had hoped. They did not emerge from the Bering Strait in 1848. The silence stretched from months into years. The Admiralty initially refused to panic, citing Franklin's extensive provisions and his experience in wintering over in the Arctic. But by the winter of 1848, the lack of communication could no longer be ignored. The Admiralty offered a reward of £20,000 to any party that rendered assistance to the crews of the Discovery ships. This reward launched a massive search effort that would map thousands of miles of the Canadian Arctic, but it would be 5 years before the first physical traces of the expedition were found. The men on the whalers were the last to see the I walked the gravel beach at Beechy Island, a desolate outcrop of limestone at the entrance to Wellington Channel. In 1850, searchers found the first evidence of the expedition's route here. Franklin's men had spent their first winter on this island, from 1845 to 1846. The searchers found the remains of a storehouse, hundreds of empty meat tins, and the anvil block from the blacksmith's forge. They also found 3 graves. The headstones, carved from oak boards, bore the names of John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. The dates of death ranged from January to April 1846. The presence of the graves indicated that the expedition had suffered early casualties, but 3 deaths out of 129 was not an unusual mortality rate for a 19th-century naval voyage. There were no written records left at the camp to explain where the ships intended to go next. The definitive answer did not emerge until 1859, when a search party led by Captain Francis McClintock reached King William Island, hundreds of miles to the south. On the island's northwestern coast, at a place called Victory Point, McClintock's men found a small stone cairn. Inside the cairn was a sealed copper cylinder containing a standard Admiralty form. I have studied the facsimile of the Victory Point record. The paper was stained with rust from the cylinder, the ink faded but legible. This single sheet of paper contains 2 distinct messages. The first message, dated May 28, 1847, was written by Lieutenant Graham Gore. It states that the Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice at latitude 70 degrees, 5 minutes north, and longitude 98 degrees, 23 minutes west. Gore wrote that Sir John Franklin was commanding the expedition, and that all was well. The tone is routine, the report of an expedition proceeding according to plan. But around the edges of the same paper, a second message was added 11 months later, on April 25, 1848. The handwriting belongs to Captain Fitzjames, and the tone is entirely different. Fitzjames wrote that the ships had been beset in the ice since September 1846. They had been trapped for 19 months. Victory Point is a barren stretch of shattered limestone, scoured by wind and devoid of vegetation. The ice in the Victoria Strait, where the ships were trapped, does not clear in the summer. It is a choke point where heavy, multi-year pack ice from the Arctic Ocean is driven south and compressed against the coastline. The second message states that Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847. The death of Franklin meant the loss of their most experienced overland traveler. It records that 24 men were dead, including 9 officers and 15 men. The loss of 9 officers out of 24 total dead was a disproportionately high casualty rate for the command structure. The command had devolved to Captain Crozier. The final sentence of the addendum is the most significant. Fitzjames wrote that they would start on tomorrow for Back's Fish River. The 105 survivors were abandoning the heavily fortified ships. They were stepping out onto the pack ice. The decision to abandon the ships on April 22, 1848, marked the beginning of the final phase of the expedition. The 105 men loaded their equipment onto massive wooden sledges. Some of these sledges carried 28-foot whaleboats, intended to navigate the open water of the rivers to the south. The total weight of a loaded sledge exceeded 2,000 pounds. The men, weakened by 3 years on shipboard rations and the creeping effects of scurvy, harnessed themselves to the tow ropes. They dragged these burdens across the jagged, pressure-ridged ice of the Victoria Strait toward the western shore of King William Island. The trail they left behind was documented by later search parties. In 1859, McClintock's expedition found a trail of discarded equipment stretching southward along the coast. The men had abandoned items that were useless for survival but heavy to drag. Searchers found brass curtain rods, silver spoons bearing the crests of the officers, mahogany writing desks, and heavy iron cooking stoves. The silver spoons and forks bore the engraved crests of Franklin, Crozier, and Fitzjames. They were heavy, ornate pieces of Victorian dining ware, carried into the wasteland. The most significant discovery was made by Lieutenant William Hobson, who found one of the whaleboats mounted on a heavy oak sledge. Inside the boat were the skeletal remains of 2 men. The boat was pointed north, back toward the abandoned ships, suggesting that a detachment had attempted to return, perhaps to retrieve more food. The contents of the boat defied logic. Hobson catalogued the inventory: a large amount of clothing, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, sponges, slippers, and several pocket watches. The pocket watches were stopped, their silver cases tarnished by the salt air. They found 2 double-barreled shotguns, loaded and cocked, resting against the gunwales. They found 40 pounds of chocolate and a small amount of tea, but no biscuits or meat. The men had hauled hundreds of pounds of dead weight while starving. Further south, at a place named Starvation Cove on the Adelaide Peninsula, searchers found more remains. Local Inuit hunters provided testimony to the searchers, describing encounters with a group of starving white men dragging a boat south. In 1854, the explorer John Ray interviewed Inuit hunters who provided the first testimony of the disaster. The Inuk hunter in Nukpujajuk told searchers that the men fell down and died as they walked. He described finding a camp where the remains indicated that the last survivors had resorted to cannibalism to sustain themselves. The British public, including Franklin's widow, vehemently rejected these reports. But the physical evidence found decades later, including cut marks on the bones, corroborated the Inuit accounts. The men had marched until their bodies failed. The heavy wool clothing, designed for standing watch on a ship, offered little protection against the wind when dragging a sledge. The leather boots froze and shattered. The trail of debris and remains maps a slow, methodical collapse of discipline and physical endurance. The expedition did not end in a... For over a century and a half, the exact resting places of the Erebus and Terror remained a mystery. The ice had crushed them, or the currents had carried them away. But in September 2014, a Canadian search expedition utilizing side-scan sonar located the wreck of HMS Erebus resting in 40 feet of water in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, far south of the original abandonment site. 2 years later, in September 2016, the Arctic Research Foundation located HMS Terror in Terror Bay, off the southwestern coast of King William Island. I watched the sonar feeds from those discoveries. The ships were not crushed to splinters. They were largely intact, sitting upright on the sea floor. The Terror was in pristine condition, its bowsprit still in place, its glass windows unbroken, the ship's bell lying on the deck. The locations of the wrecks contradict the narrative of a total and permanent abandonment in 1848. The Terror lies nearly 60 miles south of the Victory Point coordinate. The Erebus lies even further south. Ships do not drift against the prevailing ice currents into enclosed bays. The physical evidence strongly suggests that a remnant crew returned to the vessels, remanned them, and attempted to sail them south before the ice closed in again. Who commanded this final effort, and how long they survived aboard the drifting ships, is not recorded. The water temperature at the wreck sites hovers near 29 degrees Fahrenheit, limiting dive times and preserving organic material. The marine archaeologists diving on the wrecks have mapped the upper decks and recovered artifacts, ceramic plates, a bronze bell, a seaman's boot. They have found the captain's cabin on the Terror intact, the desk drawers closed, the silt preserving whatever lies inside. Furthermore, the grave of Captain Sir John Franklin has never been found. The Victory Point note states he died in June 1847, while the ships were still fully manned and operational. Naval tradition dictates he would have been buried on land, likely in a sealed vault or deep grave to protect the remains from scavengers, but no trace of his resting place has been discovered on the surrounding islands. The primary documents, the ship's logs, the scientific ledgers, the journals of Captain Crozier and Commander Fitzjames, have not been recovered. The written record of the expedition still ends on the margins of the Victory Point note in April 1848. We know what they packed in their holds. We know the coordinates where they were trapped. We know the route they attempted to walk, and the heavy, useless things they chose to carry with them. We know that the Inuit saw them dying on the ice. But the internal history of the expedition, the decisions made in the dark months of the second and third winters, the cause of the high officer mortality, the final days of the last men to perish, remains locked in the freezing water. The ice preserves the timber and the brass, but it keeps the silence.